Eh bien, bonjour, mesdames et messieurs. And I'm afraid I'm going to stop at that point, as my français du lycée won't allow me to talk. But I'd like to thank Araf for the invitation, particularly to come and talk about the theory of regulation. It's a long time since I've been asked to talk about the theory of anything, but, and I'm certainly not going to try and do that in French. Right, let's start by saying, what do we mean by repeat regulation, and why is it so common? A repeat regulation involves the resetting of price caps or the resetting of maximum prices to realign prices with costs. And it's an inevitable issue in either vertically integrated monopolies like local water and sewerage companies or in full vertically integrated companies as EDF and SNCF were in the past. But now the issue is very much about the monopoly networks, okay? And where there are monopoly networks or full monopoly industries, price resetting is inevitable. And that's because prices diverge from cost over time. And there are changes in relative input prices, there are changes in relative efficiencies and so on. Now, if you're in a competitive market, particularly in a competitive market where there's free entry and exit, then the changes in costs and prices will be reflected in the changes in output prices and quality and so on and so forth. And that happens as a part of the market development. But where there is a monopoly, there is no such mechanism, and it's down to someone, I'll use the term regulator, but in the past it used to be government as regulator, to reset these prices, as if they're not reset, companies will either carry on earning ever-increasing profits, or they'll make ever-increasing losses, and the relationship between prices and costs is arbitrary. And so that is why we have repeat regulation. And in the UK, it's periodic. I mean, it's purely by accident, but we seem to have got settled into a period of 5 years. Ofgem now uses 8 years for energy networks, but there is an allowance for a mid-term review. But that's very different from the US, where with traditional rate of return regulation, there's usually no fixed period, but either the companies or the regulators would, if the prices had got out of kilter with the costs and they diverged, that either the company would ask for a rate review or the regulatory commission or so on would ask for a rate review. But in the UK, and I get the impression in most of Europe and elsewhere, certainly once regulators are established, we have this periodic review. Now, Martin Cave mentioned the original Littlechild report, and he rightly said that never discussed repeat regulation or the resetting of the price cap. It looked as though from the report that he thought that competition would develop sufficiently quickly that you would only need this one period. However, in 1986, Stephen Littlechild was also asked about how to set RPI minus X in the water and sewerage industry. That's a much less well-known report. But he explicitly discussed the issue of how to reset X in an RPI minus X framework. And he specifically mentioned the need for the regulator in the periodic resetting to look at the scope for cost and price reductions through increased productivity and efficiency, and the need for investment and cost of capital, rate of return considerations, the kinds of things that we've talked about earlier. But I was involved in a conference just recently for the 30th anniversary of the Littlechild Telecom report, But we had one 10 years ago in 2003, and it was clear to a lot of us that repeat price cap regulation, it was not a new and completely different form of regulation, but it had become a forward-looking, incentive-based price cap where there was a major rate of return element. Essentially, the price cap and the rate of return were opposite sides of the same coin, particularly if you had a fair amount of cost pass-through. Martin mentioned there were questions about the regulatory asset base. There's a lot of interest in regulatory asset base, and I've written about it recently. You can find longer and shorter versions of what I've written. But the key thing about the regulatory asset base is it does provide a financial method of linking, and particularly linking assets and rates of return and so on. And the important thing is that any changes in the regulatory asset base and its updating rules should be transparent and predictable. And there should be no retrospective big change significant change to the regulatory asset base. Otherwise, that causes major problems for investors and so on. In the work that I did, I had access to Moody's cost of debt, and they had very heavily marked down the Netherlands energy regulator, who had previously had a good record because the Netherlands energy regulator had suddenly, without much advance warning, cut a lump from the regulatory asset base. So whatever the rules are in terms of railways and other French industries, as Martin said, it doesn't matter what the initial rules are, but it's the updating that's important. And that plays a really important role in repeat price regulation. Now, this is the bit of theory. I'm going to use the words that everyone has used up to now about information asymmetry. What exactly do we mean about information asymmetry? The point is that the companies and their managers know much more about their costs, prices, potential efficiency gains than the regulator ever can. What's more, the companies have very strong incentives so as not to have too challenging targets, only to present the information that the regulator, that they feel they have to give the regulator, and not additional information. We have this expression in English that people know where the bodies are buried, right? the dead bodies. So, and the companies know where the dead bodies are buried. They know why they died, okay? And the regulator usually can't or won't or doesn't. And so the issue is that, taking account of all of this, that regulation becomes a strategic game between the regulator and the regulated companies. Okay? What's more, with repeat regulation, is it's a repeated game. And it's what's known as a non-zero sum repeated game. In other words, if the game all works out very well, the consumers on whose behalf the regulator is acting, they will gain, and the companies will gain in that way. But repeated games, particularly non-zero-sum ones, are very complex. They have many possible solutions, and they could easily go wrong. The most important point about them is that they depend on establishing reputation, trust, and effective signalling. So Coca-Cola and PepsiCo, I should say, this kind of thinking is very well developed in economist theory of oligopolies, industries where there are only a very few players. And there are lots of examples. And among the classics are Coca-Cola against Pepsi-Cola, or McDonald's against Wendy hamburgers, or so on. But there's also this repeated non-zero-sum game development was the basis of a lot of analysis for the Cold War. And in fact, the founder of this method of analysis, John von Neumann, He was heavily involved from about 1944 in this, to the extent that when in the mid-50s he was dying, he was kept in a room where no one could go near who didn't have security clearance in case he gave away secrets in his delirium. Anyway, the point about this is the framework in which I think we need to consider repeat regulation. Now, if you take this line of argument, companies always prefer to turn regulatory reviews as far as possible into general negotiations, where everything is on the table, and the regulator is always saying, well, that's very interesting, but please can you provide the information and so on. The opposite side of the coin is that regulators want and need to structure price resetting within a common formula, and with common formula, common procedures and decision-making, particularly decision-making basis. And in terms of transparency and predictability, which are the key issues of regulatory governance, that gets very important. So starting in the 1990s, in the UK, we developed yardstick regulation, which was based to a considerable extent on econometric benchmarking of efficiency. Now, that really began and was most attractive if we were talking about electricity or gas distribution companies, where there were about 10 of them. It was much, much more difficult with single national networks, where you have to do international comparison. And Cécile Georges referred earlier to the questions of how do you compare a flat country with a mountainous country or different populations. But so that yardstick of regulation was based. It was originally yardstick regulation based on operating costs. It was very difficult at that time to bring capital expenditure into this, which raised the capex biases we've talked about. However, when you did this, I remember there were 10 companies, and at that time we only had cross-section data. We didn't have longitudinal data, panel data. So you were trying to fit equations for operating expenditure with about 10 observations. So these equations usually weren't very good. The panel data only became available kind of sometime later. But by 2003-05, regulators were becoming more pessimistic about how much weight this benchmarking could take, and in particular how far it solved the information asymmetry problems. And this was most obvious in energy and water. There have been two main sets of proposed solutions. They've both already been in the UK, and they've both already been mentioned today. The first is menu regulation, which is one of what I call set of information revelation devices, and the second is negotiated settlements. Now, I'm going to go into a little bit of detail on all of these, but the way of thinking about them is that menu regulation, which is a derivation, as Martin explained, from an extremely elegant piece of economics by Lafont-Tirole. And the second is negotiated settlements, which is the latest attempt by Stephen Littlechar to try and abolish monopsony regulation. But the first is an essentially technocratic solution, and it works within the framework of existing regulation. The second one is actually an attempt, to some extent, how far is debatable, to replace the monopsony regulator, Ofgem, I'm afraid I don't remember the name of the CRE, and all the others, by assisted customer negotiation. But they do have one thing in common, which is both are attempts to give the regulated companies some structured choices within a framework. And if it gives the companies those kind of choices, it's very different from the regulator saying, well, we've done all the kind of benchmarking and so on and so forth, and the benchmarking gives us this result, and we think that's where the solution ought to be. But if you use these kinds of mechanism, it means the companies having to decide and think hard about what it wants to do and where it has to be. And the company is involved in making choices, but within a structured framework that discourages gaming. Okay? That was a very long sentence, but I hope you get the point of it, is that it's a way of bringing companies in and giving choices, but without everything being arbitrary. Okay. Right. Now, I'm going to go quickly through this, as Martin said, some of it. Menu regulation provides incentives for the companies to reveal their current expected future costs by making choices on required future expenditure, but required future expenditure to meet mandated standards. Okay? And that's the way the quality is handled, because it's mandated standards and there are quality standards. And the basis of this is La Fontaine's theory of incentive-compatible contracts about procurement. Procurement? Why procurement? Well, in this case, it's the regulator is procuring the service on behalf of the customers. And it was initially introduced in the UK by Ofgem for electricity distribution companies, and it has since been extended, and it's been extended not just to gas distribution, but also to electricity transmission. I was involved in trying to persuade Ofwat to use it in about 2007-8. To my great surprise and delight, they did, although they didn't do it very well in 2009. And I understand that ORR has mentioned that it's one of the possibilities they might be considering for PR18. And I'm going to conclude my presentation by things on railways. I'll say a bit more about that then. Okay, so menu regulation requires the companies to choose the amount of input expenditure that they're going to meet, and it's relative to a baseline proposed by the regulator. And the baseline is derived from business plans and so on. And benchmarking does not disappear within this framework. I mean, you still need good econometric benchmarking, and you can use it either to set the baseline, or the regulator can use it to test the kind of projections that the companies have made, whether or not they're reasonable. So it's not that benchmarking disappears or becomes less important. It's just that it becomes one tool among others in helping devise this strategy. And in menu regulation, the companies choose between the lower expenditure allowance, but which if they beat the target and meet the more standards, deliver the required outputs more efficiently, they earn a higher rate of return, and conversely, the other way. And the point is that the lower the expenditure allowance, the closer it is to pure price cap, and the more they ask for a higher expenditure allowance and get fewer benefits if they keep it, the closer it is to cost plus rate of return. Now, that has been going on. In 2010, but it has since been supplemented. Martin mentioned the question about fast tracking and slow tracking, and Ofgem and Ofwat have both introduced this. And it's a question where strong performers, with people and who companies who have performed well in the past, have strong business plans, a good path track, and effective consultation with consumers, and effective consultation with all the relevant consumers, and they can demonstrate it's effective, they will get fast-tracked. Poor performers who perfunctory customer negotiations and so on get slow-tracked. And there's some in the middle. The point is, in the fast track, they say so long as the bids and so on look as though they're going to be convincing and work, very little time needs to be spent negotiating or discussing with the company on the details of the regulatory proposals. On the other hand, if you're slow-tracked, you get quizzed over every single kind of variable, and there are the ones in the middle. So it's a question of the burden of proof on the companies and the amount of management time. And we had the question earlier about what does regulation cost. But one of the most important questions in and around is what does regulation cost the companies? And in a really, really drawn-out regulatory process, it can cost the companies a very great deal of time, particularly in strategic management thing. And so the cost to a company of being slow-tracked can be quite considerable, and the benefits to the company of being fast-tracked are also quite considerable. And actually, some of the evidence is from Ofgem that fast-track and slow-track, again, it's an information revelation device, and it hasn't replaced menu regulation, they keep it. But the fast-track and the slow-track, if anything, have stronger incentive effects. As it pushes the companies to provide the kind of information and in a structured way that allows comparisons and so on, these burdens of regulation. Now, menu regulation has often been criticised as too complex. The fashionable phrase is it's desperately wonkish. Qu'est-ce que c'est le français pour wonkish? Tell me afterwards. And to the extent that in 2010, I think it was, the Ofgem Rio review, the chief executive of Ofgem, when announcing this, said, we're going to simplify regulation and we're going to look particularly hard at these complex incentive mechanisms like menu regulation that no one understands. That was before not just menu regulation got continued for the electricity distribution companies, but it got extended to the other companies. Now, we've got to ask the question, why do we, what are the benefits of regulation and so on? To which one of the answers is, well, actually, they provide benefits and no one ever says they ought to go. And in this case, menu regulation, everyone says, oh, it looks awful and complicated, but actually regulators wanted to use it. Is it does tackle the asymmetry of information directly and practically, and it reduces the incentives for gaming and strategic behaviour, but while recognising in essence uncertainty. Now, negotiated settlements. Stephen Littlechild has been promoting these negotiated settlements, which imply negotiations. And there are various examples. It was the 2003 conference I mentioned where he first came up with this suggestion for the UK. He's talking about Florida, but it also had been done by FERC. And constructive engagement, which is a less formal negotiation, was used by the airports regulator, the CAA in the UK, in 2009. And Littlechild argues that it provides a different philosophy of regulation, which is more productive, less costly and risky, leading to better understanding with more acceptable and often innovative outcomes. Well, maybe. Actually, I'm more of a fan, I'm less of a critic of all of this than some other people. But the interesting thing is, particularly, the most convincing case is with FERC, which is talking about interstate pipelines. So you have interstate gas pipeline companies who are negotiating with large, well-informed gas companies. And it is a very, very different story once you start involving household consumers. And the process still involves considerable input from the regulator. It's not the regulator disappeared. And because the industries are regulated, there are legislators, the regulator has to ensure that the legal requirements are all met. And it has to ensure that you can still have new entry. And as I mentioned earlier, the real question is, who do we mean by the customers? And in many cases, most obviously in rail, the question of who the customers are is very difficult. So for that kind of reason, the UK regulators like Ofgem and Ofwat have opted for consumer engagement and much more in customer engagement within the regulatory framework rather than scrapping it all and having negotiated settlements. However, as someone mentioned earlier, the Scottish water regulator has gone further And I'm going to be a bit more than that. I'm going to be about... I have a 1-minute sign, but I want to say something about railways. So I'm going to be running late and will incur the necessary penalty. So what that means is that, going to this last point, everyone agrees that much more discussion with final customers is necessary and so on. But that does not solve the strategic game. Okay? If the theme of this talk is how do you resolve the strategic game, then it's very important. And I personally cannot see how you would bring in negotiated settlements for household consumers in energy and water, let alone for railway customers. Okay, this is where I'm claiming my extra 2 minutes. There is a major... I want to say something about all of this in terms of railways. And the key point is with railways, is that railways, in virtually all industry, in all countries, passenger railways are heavily subsidised. Okay. In Britain, the subsidy was at one point, total subsidy was around 60% of the network rail revenues. It's now come down a fair amount. Now, in that case, and the standard issue for control of regulatory governance is that it's purely the company and the regulator who are responsible for the outcomes. The regulator sets the framework, the company makes all its commercial and so on decisions, and that determines its outputs and its revenues and its profits. Where there is subsidies, that is not the case, right? Because where there is subsidies is that as soon as the regulator sets a challenging target, the company goes to the ministry and says, look what this terrible new regulator is doing to us. You know, do you really think that this is a great idea? Martin talked about this in the context of Royal Mail, which is also subsidised. But in the UK, there was the exact case where Network Rail had almost run out of money in 2000, 2001, and they decided they weren't going to go to the regulator, they went to the government. In fact, it was the wrong choice, but hey. But what it means is the government is always a much more active partner in regulatory decisions and so on than it is in the other infrastructure industries. And that means that there are great possibilities for the government and the rail company to collude to marginalise the regulator. And in fact, if you've got 3 parties, any 2 parties could set up to collude against the other. And in any event, the single network company is always a very powerful player, even if it's privately owned, let alone state-owned. Now, it's because of that reason that I suggest that menu regulation and IRDs may be suitable for railway regulation, but negotiated settlements cannot be. Right? And negotiated settlements cannot be because there's the whole question of the railway customers paying the fares relative to the railway customers, taxpayers, paying the subsidies. Okay, finally, I'm almost finished. We're all agreed from previous things that economic regulation of a single national network is particularly difficult, even more difficult with subsidy. So in that case, there are major potential regulatory gains from splitting up the railway network into semi-separate business units. You can do that in railways, unlike electricity, because trains don't go at the speed of light, nor do they have to follow Kirchhoff's law. Okay? So you can split them up, and that allows yardstick performance comparisons, and it also allows much stronger regulatory econometric modelling, where you can compare across the region, and a wider range of information revelation devices, both menus and IRDs. And I am delighted to say that ORR and Network Rail, as Richard explained earlier, have been looking at regional unbundling via route devolution. And this seems to be the way to go, very much to ease the kind of strategic gaming issues of a large, powerful, subsidized national company against a regulatory regime suffering from information asymmetry. And at that point, merci à tous. Thank you for your patience, and I will stop.